Welcome, fellow Kiss fans. Welcome to a new episode of It's All For You Demons, celebrating the fun of being a Kiss fan. My name is Rick. Disclaimer: today's episode is not going to be about Kiss. It is going to be about rock and roll history, and quite possibly one of the biggest bands of all time. A little group from Liverpool, England, who came to Kansas City 54 years ago this week. In 1964, Charles Finley, the then owner of the Kansas City Athletics ball team, persuaded Brian Epstein to bring the Beatles to Kansas City for a one-off performance on a day that should have been a day off in New Orleans. Burning their candle at both ends, the Beatles played a very short set list, only lasting 32 minutes. The set opened with a cover of the song Kansas City, Hey Hey Hey, which the Beatles later recorded for the Beatles for Sale record. And in attendance that night were my mom and dad. I pretty much became a Beatles fan around 7th grade, completely dove into them and fell in love with the phenomenon of Beatlemania and how big a rock and roll band could be, which is clearly obvious why I became a Kiss fan. Now, my mom explained that her tickets cost $8.50, a fact that she hid from her mom because the tickets were so expensive. $8.50 in 1964 is about $70 today, so pretty much the price of a normal concert today. But back then, you were seeing rock and roll royalty. And I have pretty much been fascinated with this story of the Beatles playing here in Kansas City since I was 13 years old. And today, I am going to retrace the steps the Beatles took when they came to town 54 years ago this week. Today, it's all for you, John, celebrating the fun the day the Beatles came to Kansas City. Now, when the Beatles landed in Kansas City, they landed at the downtown Municipal Airport, and they landed at 2 a.m. on September 17th and were greeted by 200 local fans who stood out in the rain to get a glimpse of the Beatles arriving in town. Now, I know that any day that my friends and I have done a meet and greet or arrived early at a concert venue hoping to meet a rock band, even if it turned up negative and nothing good or eventful came from that day, it was still a very magical day. So I can imagine that that day in 1964, for those 200 kids waiting to get a glimpse of the Beatles, had to be pretty spectacular. And when the Beatles arrived, they stayed here in the penthouse, Hotel MUEHLEBACH. The Beatles spent the night here and held a press conference for the concert the next day. And as I stated earlier, September 17th was to be a day off for the Beatles, a day off in New Orleans. New Orleans is decadent any time of the year, any day of the year. Imagine how decadent and fun New Orleans would have been for the biggest band in the world in the swinging 60s. The Beatles might have been a little angry about losing their day off and playing a show in Kansas City. At their press conference here at the Hotel MUEHLEBACH, John was asked, "Is there anywhere in the United States you would like to visit?" He replied, "Yes, New Orleans." It's just pretty awesome to think that 54 years ago, rock and roll royalty stayed here and played here in town. A concert that probably shouldn't have happened, but it did. And local fans, my parents included, got to see the phenomenon known as the Beatles. And it was here, 54 years ago, this week, that the Beatles played in Kansas City. Now what is left here is pretty much just a field and houses and some historical monuments to the sports players that once played here. But this is where the stadium was, and you can see we are here, and so the stands would have been approximately here, and the Beatles would have played somewhere out in that field that is nothing but grass, houses, and construction now. Now my mom did say her tickets were $8.50, and I know that the tickets ranged from $2 to $8.50. And she said they were on the field, so I'm assuming that the $8.50 tickets were out there somewhere on that field. And there it is, 1964. Musical group The Beatles played a concert here at Municipal Stadium. So what is now just grass and houses was once the spot of rock and roll history. It's pretty cool to imagine that at one time 4 legendary rock stars from Liverpool played rock and roll music in this field. It's pretty cool to me to think that my parents 54 years ago this week were literally on this grass about to see the biggest band ever in the world. That is rock and roll magic. Thank you for hanging with me today. Thank you for taking a trip down memory lane 54 years ago this week when the Beatles came to Kansas City. Take care, be safe, never stop having fun, and I will talk to you soon.
The Beatle boycott is still in effect. We haven't forgotten what the Beatles said.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it.
The fact, and it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, I'm not saying that we're better or greater, or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person, or God as a thing, or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong, or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
There have even been threats against your life, there have been record burnings, you've been banned from some radio stations. Does this bother you?
Well, it worries me.
Yeah, you know, it's bound to bother us. Do you think you're being crucified?
No, I wouldn't say that at all.
This is Doug Layton and Tommy Charles reminding you our fantastic Beatle boycott is still in effect. Don't you forget what the Beatles have said.
Don't forget to take your Beatle records and your Beatle paraphernalia to any one of our 14 pickup points in Birmingham, Alabama, and turn them in this week if possible.